Epstein, what's even going on with that? What's your take on it? And, is Trump involved in any way? Or is Trump not involved? Is this being used against Trump? You know, I'm actually a conspiracy theorist, a pretty serious one. That's why not everyone likes me very much. I believe it's impossible to hang yourself in a self-guarded prison, in a self-guarded cell under 4 surveillance cameras, because apparently he slipped on bananas like 8 times. And for some strange reason, for no apparent reason, Clinton was seen an hour before that, just visiting there. So, and we know from the history of the Clinton family that everyone who wanted to testify against Clinton somehow strangely slipped on bananas. There were 15 of them, including an FBI agent. It's just weird. One stabbed himself with a fork 5 times, another somehow drowned while hiking somewhere. And that's just how it is with them. Well, people just somehow, ended up dead in such a dead-end kind of way. Everyone who spoke out against Clinton, they all disappeared here. Dmitry, what do you think? Is there any truth to what I'm saying? Or is this just serious conspiracy talk?
Well, to be honest, as for whether this whole thing was somehow connected to the Clintons or not, we don't know. From what we can assess, well, Epstein's cell was thoroughly photographed when it became a crime scene, and it's quite obvious that, well, there are grounds for suspicion. There are grounds for suspicion because, well, honestly, in a cell like that, it was probably easier to just order yourself to stop breathing them, so to speak, to actually hang yourself. That's a fact. There were a lot of things that fueled all sorts of conspiracy theories, and that's obvious too. Because, in fact, he was brought to that detention center for one specific purpose, so that he would live until the trial and testify.
Okay.
And that's exactly the task they, so to speak, failed to accomplish. He had a cellmate, and this cellmate was specifically vetted, so to speak, actually by both the prison department and the Justice Department, to make sure he wasn't dangerous or anything like that. But then, as it happened, he disappeared precisely on that night. He was transferred to another place. And the third point is, of course, an absolutely stunning thing that just came to light now when the Trump-appointed Attorney General Pam Bondi, she posted, as she said, raw video, meaning in raw format. And in this raw format, it turned out that, first of all, there's about 1 minute and 20 seconds missing. Just over 1 minute is gone. Right around midnight, when Epstein supposedly died, well, supposedly at that time. Yeah. And secondly, there were several, if I'm not mistaken, Wired magazine was the first to look into this case. They hired several metadata analysis experts, and the file's metadata showed that, most likely, the video had been edited. Yeah, there's no indication that it was edited with malicious intent. I mean, there are interruptions in the streams, things like that, and so on. But at the very least, this video is made up of 2 parts. And judging by the metadata, it was edited either directly in Adobe Premiere Pro, which is one of the most common video editing programs, at a basic level, or in something that shares similar code with Adobe Premiere.
Oh.
So basically, honestly, well, maybe it would have been better if they just hadn't posted the video at all, or at least watched it first, I don't know. I mean, they kind of fueled this version themselves. And then all of a sudden, they completely changed course and said, no, he really did commit suicide. Not only did he really commit suicide, but there is no Epstein list at all, and nothing that even resembles an Epstein list exists. And everything that, wasn't published at the time basically consists of scenes of those very Epstein's activities, right, involving his clients, which amounts to child pornography, so they won't be showing it. And so, in general, the Trump administration, despite such a sharp turnaround, of course ended up spawning a whole bunch of conspiracy theories itself. At the same time, you have to understand that this whole MAGA movement, 70% of it is about everything else, and 30% is about the Epstein case. Well, so to speak, as Trump was gearing up for his second term, you have to understand that this was in many ways his base, that is, the electoral and elite groups that ultimately supported him, including many digital magnates. Well, some digital magnates, not that many, but a few digital magnates really did support him. But they supported him. Well, about 70%. There was the economy, foreign policy. There were a lot of different factors, but 30% of it was all this whole suspicion connected to the deep state, to the intelligence community. And in the midst of all this elite depravity and, so to speak, Jeffrey Epstein. Because, of course, you have to understand that it's one thing to have known Jeffrey Epstein in the 90s. That was before his first conviction, and not many people knew about his activities back then. And now, CNN, MSNBC, and many other channels are showing these videos of a young Trump and, accordingly, a young Epstein. They're both still young there, at some social events. But it has to be said that, yes, he really did socialize very quickly, Epstein. Which, by the way, is also a huge mystery in itself. Where did he get that kind of money? A guy without a college degree. Just, for a second. Yeah, he was giving millionaires and billionaires advice on economics, financial investments, investment security, and accounting, without having what you'd call a college degree. That's a pretty curious thing. Well, alright, whatever, let's just leave it at that. Let's say he's a genius, even though that's also very well. But he was then put in prison for the first time. He was in prison during his first term, and it's also important to point out here, worth reminding, that something really strange happened. It's a strange thing because, well, there were a whole series of charges brought against him at the state level in Florida and also at the federal level. Yeah, so to speak. There were also federal charges, and the FBI was involved in the case. And then suddenly, as it happened, the person who, by the way, was Trump's Secretary of Education during his first term, I think it was Alexander Acosta at that time, he was the district attorney in Florida. So, as a result, he ended up making an absolutely outrageous deal, a plea bargain, thanks to which Epstein got 18 months in what was basically a luxury resort. No one even tried to hide the conditions he was kept in. His cell was never locked. He could go out into the city, just by signing his name in a logbook. That's how it was. But, nevertheless, he only got 18 months. The federal charges just disappeared somewhere. At the state level, there was only one charge left, forcing a person under 18 into prostitution. After that, and this is where it gets really interesting, because after that, he gets out of prison, he gets stamped as a registered sex offender, and everyone knows that this sexual crime was committed against minors. But his wealth starts growing like crazy. And he socializes with literally everyone. The entire Washington, D.C. elite, so to speak, and New York, and the European elite, too. Yeah. Then it spreads to Britain and continental Europe, too, yeah. They're all tied up with him, connected, involved, and so on. And most of those people, so to speak, who were suspected in this whole thing, they even flew to his island on that charter flight, which people among themselves called the Lolita Express. So this is actually an amazing thing. Because if you saw, I don't know, some people next to Epstein in the 90s, that's one thing. People might have suspected something, but it wasn't, so to speak. First of all, Epstein's operation, his criminal enterprise, is not the one where he was supposedly doing consulting. This criminal enterprise was running like clockwork, with all this pedophilia involved. And everyone knew it, and they knew that he had already, so to speak, been convicted as a sex offender against minors. Nevertheless, everyone dealt with him. Everyone greeted him. Everyone shook his hand, with rare exceptions. I have to say, Trump was one of those exceptions. But they say there are two versions. Either Trump simply decided to refuse to associate with him after finding out what he was up to. The second version is that they had a falling out over some real estate property in Miami. Well, we don't really know for sure, but everyone else kept being friends with Epstein, knowing who he was, and that he kept doing it on an even bigger scale. Of course, looking at all this Western depravity from the outside, well, that's the best example of what they call Russian propaganda. You don't need any Russian propaganda at all. Just show how it works. If you haven't flown to Epstein's Island, you're not part of the elite. You want to be elite? Then go there, to the girls and boys. That's it. Once you go through Epstein's Island, then we'll let you into the elite. Everyone knew this. Everyone just knew. It actually took an incredible effort, really, to open another criminal case against him in 2018, and then in 2019, he was arrested. And that's how it all went. After that, before the trial, he killed himself, or so we don't really know. Yeah. At the same time, the only person actually serving time for all of this is Ghislaine Maxwell, his, well, girlfriend. Yeah, and why is she still alive? She knows the same things he did. Well, apparently, yes. She was his main accomplice. So you can't say she didn't know anything. Of course she knew everything. She was his accomplice. It was well known that she helped him with all his affairs. She was his most trusted person, as Epstein's own lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, said. He called her the Rosetta Stone of the Epstein case, meaning she knows everything, so to speak. If the other issue is there are doubts about whether she can actually tell the truth in this situation, because, well, why would she want to reveal anything, so to speak? That's it. And in this sense, by the way, some people are already saying that she was summoned for questioning in the House of Representatives. Although, to be honest, it's not very clear there. Johnson dissolved the lower House of Parliament, supposedly, so they wouldn't have to deal with this case. He dissolved that chamber precisely so that they wouldn't investigate the Epstein case. Well, there you go. And so, the Justice Department also summoned her for questioning because of this. How much time does she have left to live, right? The question is, how much time does she have left? Yeah, that's the question. By the way, a lot of people are worried that the same thing could happen to her as happened to Epstein. Well, that's how it is. And of course, we have to understand that the Democrats are now using the Epstein case against Trump in the sense that naturally they took advantage of the political opportunity because as Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader in the lower house, says one simple thing, listen, either you lied for a decade about how important the Epstein case really is, that there's something there that needs to be revealed, and for that you need to make Donald Trump president, or that's it. Or yourselves are involved in this case. That is, Trump or someone from his closest circle, accordingly his associates, are involved in this. That's exactly why you decided not to publish these materials. So, well, of course, there's a third option. And all sorts of them, one of the most exotic ones.
They felt sorry for the victims.
Well, feeling sorry for the victims isn't really worth it either, so to speak, and honestly, it's not even worth a penny. Because in reality, it's obvious that part of the hearings and some of these materials can be handed over to the congressman accordingly in a closed session. Secondly, if there really is something in this case that not only shows how the victims became victims, but also something that could actually incriminate, so to speak, high-ranking people in the United States, then this can be done behind closed doors, without involving the victims, but later drawing the appropriate conclusions, yes, so to speak, based on the materials that are currently available. Well, what we see now is that if in New York, the grand jury has apparently given permission to publish part of the materials, I doubt that these are the materials that the general public is interested in. And well, in Florida, the case from 2005 and 2007 was simply closed. And the judge of the appellate court, the federal appellate court in Florida, said, no, we won't allow it. And this, of course, raises some separate questions. There are some exotic theories as to why
Okay.
he really wasn't let in, but one of them is very popular in the MAGA movement. And I have to say, there was a recent conference, Turning Point USA, where literally all the stars, all the MAGA stars you can think of, spoke. They were all talking about the same thing. Well, of course, Epstein is an agent of the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad. You, of course, denied us the chance to learn the truth precisely at the moment when Netanyahu was in Washington. That's it. Because, well, by the way, it's mentioned we don't actually know if he was an agent of any intelligence service. I actually did a big review and analysis of this whole case on my channel. I showed that, of course, we'll probably never know the truth. But you can't say there aren't any arguments supporting that idea at all. Because, as we were saying about Ghislaine Maxwell, her father was definitely a Mossad operative, well, an agent, so to speak. He was, you could say, their asset. Yes, he was connected to that intelligence agency. At the same time, most likely, he never met his would-be son-in-law, Epstein. Or maybe he did. Nobody really knows how it all happened. It's absolutely clear that he was a close friend of Ehud Barak. Ehud Barak lived in his house. This is, so to speak, a matter of record, because he officially lived in one of Epstein's residences in New York. So, in reality, you can't say there's nothing at all to this version. Because, of course, Epstein did have a business, so to speak. Plus, in the case materials, here's what you might call an authentic but fake document. It's authentic in the sense that it's a real document, but it's fake because, well, it can't be that there's an Austrian passport for Epstein with his photo, which he used to enter and leave the country many times. And from the materials, it's clear that it was Epstein traveling on this passport, which, under a different name, lists him as a resident of Saudi Arabia. Obviously, with enough money, you can probably do just about anything. But again, this only adds to the suspicions. And this is, in general, quite a serious matter. I think that here, it's not even about whether he was a Mossad agent or if he and Trump were actually involved in those same immoral acts with minors. That's not what's most important. What matters is that this has already sparked a political wave. So when Trump says, how much more can we talk about Epstein? Let's talk about Texas, or I don't know, tariffs on steel and aluminum. That's not going to work. It just won't fly. This issue isn't going away, because it's precisely this case that was really tied to or energized a part of the MAGA movement. Now Trump is saying, well, we're going to publish what Obama did in 2016, 2017. Well, no, that's not going to work either. It's just not going to happen.
That's pretty weak.
What?
Really weak.
Well, lately it's actually kind of an interesting thing. I mean, just looking at body language, at facial expressions, even Pam Bondi, who turned out to be a woman who, so to speak, can chew through steel with her teeth, right? And then there's Tulsi Gabbard, who people had such high hopes for, a girl who is supposed to take apart the deep state and rebuild it to make America great again, right? Well, honestly, they look really pathetic. So, for example, take Pam Bondi, who said, I didn't mean that I had Epstein's list on my desk. I meant that I have a file, and I'm looking for Epstein's list in it, and I didn't find it. Or, for example, that actually this 1.5 minute gap in the recording in 2019, not 1999, but 2019, 2 decades later. So when I talked about this 1.5 minute gap, someone who works in the security service at Piedraka wrote to me, that's a supermarket chain. And he says, that just doesn't happen. What year was this system made that it needs to be rebooted? Even in the worst store, 4,500 kilometers from Moscow, it just records over the old footage. That's in the worst case scenario. There's never a 1.5 minute gap. It's all complete.
Overwrite it.
Yeah, it overwrites. Exactly. Well, I mean, I don't know. I can only suggest that the Ministry of Justice come to Russia for an internship so they can see for themselves that they've been lied to. Or maybe they just made up this version on the fly. When you make things up.
It's just absurd.
Distrust keeps building up. That's the real issue. That was the first time with Musk. And the second moment is the Epstein case. This isn't just a quarrel with undecided voters anymore. It's not a spat with, I don't know, some Democrats who might have voted for Trump or one of his allies. Now it's a conflict with the base. That's the real problem. So, disappointment among the base. Look, I get that Trump only needs one term, but people really pin their hopes on him. That's the thing. And honestly, it's a serious issue.
There's one thing I don't get. Maybe I'm missing something. Look, Epstein was alive. All the elite were hanging out with him. The guy was at the top of the pyramid. And suddenly, they decided to put him in jail a second time. Who made that decision? If all the elite were with him, who needed this to happen? Who are these people? Who is this opposing organization? Who actually decided to take him out and start digging into this when all the elite were involved? It just looks weird, honestly.
Well, actually, as it turned out, not all the elite were involved after all. That much is clear too. You have to understand, though, that there's one thing here that's really important. The best way to understand these kinds of comparisons is to realize that things like this can happen even in what seems like a completely controlled environment. Well, for example, in Stalin's Soviet Union, you can point to 2 or 3 cases where people who seemed absolutely untouchable. Take Tukhachevsky, for instance, right? Suddenly, he just gets taken down. And it's clear that if Tukhachevsky, hadn't, so to speak, started showing off in some way, he probably would have gotten off pretty easy. And in the same way, Epstein got off very easy the first time. That's obvious. They went after him, but he got off with a slap on the wrist. But there's always one simple thing that people overlook. The deep state, which, by the way, was first called deep state by Americans in the 1930s, specifically in reference to the Soviet Union. Back then, they meant the NKVD and later the MGB. Yeah. But in reality, it's not any intelligence community of the United States or anything like that. The real deep state is the bureaucratic machine itself. It has millions of heads. Among those people who are truly influential, there are at least hundreds of thousands who can actually make such decisions. It's actually very hard to catch them for anything because they have a very strong corporate solidarity. And most importantly, no one wants to mess with them. Most of the court decisions that Trump still can't get through in the United States are because the courts don't want to get involved with its machine. And by the way, it's quite interesting to note that some of the most highly protected employees in terms of their labor contracts and agreements are precisely the federal government employees here in the United States of America. At some point, apparently, he crossed the wrong path, not with someone really important. He just got caught in the gears of the machine. And instead of, as they say, maneuvering in some way, right? That is to say, to make some concessions somewhere, to back down a bit, and so on. Apparently, he decided he'd already caught God by the beard, since he was untouchable.
Or something like that.
Yeah. Well, it's very similar to what happened with Tukhachevsky in the 30s, because, it seemed like he was everyone's favorite, that only Stalin was above him, and that was it. But as it turned out, that wasn't quite the case. And in fact, this machine is very good at doing its job as soon as someone gets caught in its gears. And basically, it turned out that for the elite connected with Epstein, the energy cost of getting rid of him in prison was incomparably lower than the cost of getting him off the hook, which would have required them to literally expose themselves. So this is something that's pretty understandable. I should also mention that we need to remember this was 2018. This was 2018. And besides this government apparatus, which he most likely crossed paths with, in some of his dealings, an unexpected ally appeared for this apparatus in the form of the Tea Party among some Republicans, which, in fact, was already around in 2018. But as far as I remember, by then it was already preparing, so to speak, for the midterm elections and so on. But it was already at the peak of its influence, shifting into Trump's camp. Back then, right in the first term, these people still hadn't gotten used to Washington, and they really, just like Vance, they really came in a way straight from the plow and immediately found themselves with quite a lot of influence. They made their way in there. Yes, it was a whole process. It was also a political machine at work. But the political class, this new one, somehow decided that if things start getting pushed through them that they don't like, if you give in to them now, you'll never get back up again. And it's this combination of the federal bureaucratic machine and these young, early Republicans. But they're not all young in a sense of being politically young. So it played exactly that role. And in situations like this, the elite always acts this way. It's easier for them to eliminate the source of danger.
No person, no problem.
Yes, exactly. That's right, exactly so, right? I mean, kind of, why cover for him, so to speak, for a second time, or anything like that? Especially since in 2018, even though Donald Trump had already been more or less tied hand and foot, Donald Trump still remained a big question mark at that time, how he would act in this situation. Yeah, he didn't have, so to speak, an attorney general like the one we have now. But as we can see, even this kind of attorney general sometimes backs down in this situation. Actually, the Epstein case is a good example, but there are many others as well. But the Epstein case, the thing is, it's not just that. Many other things tell me that Trump has already given up about 2/3 of the way. But, well, the Epstein case is the main thing. It's what really showed that Trump gave up. And in my opinion, this is a political development of the situation that really wasn't apparent at the beginning of the term. I mean, 3 or 4 months ago, it wasn't clear that everyone would end up dissatisfied with the decision of Trump's Justice Department and that the whole Turning Point USA conference would be criticizing their beloved Trump, his administration, and so on. This is a political development that really wasn't anticipated. I don't think the Epstein case itself will actually lead to anything, so to speak, because honestly, I think that over the break, any documents that exist will conveniently disappear. And even if there were any, it's obvious that there isn't any handwritten list of Epstein's clients. It's all nonsense. Yeah, but, well, things like what Pam Bondi said about having, all the flight lists, that is, the lists of people who traveled on that charter, to that so-called pedophile island. But, that could easily disappear, but overall, the stain will remain. In my opinion, that's a pretty serious wound.
All right, Dmitry, look, there were a lot of victims, and all the victims are still alive, and they can speak for themselves. They were intimidated, they were bought off because, well, it has to come out somewhere, somehow. Or do you really think they bought off all of them?
No, well, if you go after this aggressively, then yes, it's possible. But again, this is a crime of such a high level. This is very important, in my opinion. Well, that's my point of view. I'm not forcing it on anyone, but from the perspective of the philosophy of power, this is a very important thing. Cases like this don't get investigated during politically stable times, no matter where it is, autocracy, so to speak, democracy, whatever monarchy, republic, it doesn't matter. Only at a revolutionary turning point do cases like this, so to speak, come up. That is, you can, so to speak, bring all this out into the open only if you practically reset, well, at least by 2/3, the political class and the bureaucracy. So if you're ready to go for it, you start, well, I don't know, figuratively speaking, like an ancient Rus, setting up execution blocks right in the city centers, so to speak. That's it. Not so much because you want to kill everyone, but because you want to scare everyone. That's it. It's like your patience has snapped. But this is done at a major turning point. That is, when you want to break the whole thing. And, well, you don't necessarily have to be a revolutionary from below to do this. Very often, it was done by revolutionaries from above. Take someone like Ivan Vasilyevic IV, who was mistakenly called the Terrible. He did exactly that. He created a parallel state structure, the Oprichnina, which devoured the state apparatus and the political class that disagreed with the reforms. But this is exactly what people expected from Trump, in theory. But since, apparently, there won't be any revolution, it's like, well, let's just do an Epstein. That's the way it is, that is, since you don't touch the elite, you're not going to fight them.
Yes.
But then the Epstein case must be hushed up, of course.
Look, Dmitry, a couple of days ago, Trump said these words. He says, I once let Clinton go because I thought you shouldn't go after the First Lady, and everything was just running its course. But since everything that was done to me, those were his words. I now think everyone should be put on trial, including Obama and everyone else. Why did Trump say that then? He's trying to scare them so they won't go after him. Or is he really going to put them on trial like he promised? Because the CIA director is currently under prosecution.
Well, under investigation. He's not on trial, he's under investigation. He's under investigation. There's no trial going on there. And, like, there's nothing big happening there yet.
I misspoke. I meant to say under investigation.
Yeah. But again, this investigation, well, they carried out some investigative actions, and that was it. Honestly, I think August is going to be the best time for Trump to finally shake things up and start, so to speak, waving his saber around, or whatever it is they wave in America. I don't know, maybe a broadsword, like they did during the Civil War.
It's about time.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. But now, well, it's vacation time, this recess, right, and that's really the perfect time to get down to business, because even according to the Constitution, this is the golden time for the executive branch. If he gets to it, well, there's still, let's say, some hope for a turning point, maybe, right? But for now, I don't see things moving toward a turning point. And he can say whatever he wants, but, well, let me give you a few examples of statements. The Houthis have surrendered. That means the Iranian nuclear program has been completely destroyed. And so on, right? Here's another absolutely remarkable thing. A year ago, the country was dead, and now it's the hottest spot from an economic standpoint. We have economic growth like we've never seen in our history. So Trump says all sorts of things, and everyone kind of understands this, because, well, the man needs to constantly keep himself energized. But when none of what you say actually happens, it's actually a rather curious thing. I mean, he can say right now that he'll put everyone in jail, but I don't think he'll actually put anyone in jail. This is, well, so to speak, moreover, what Tulsi Gabbard just did with her statement, in my opinion, this statement that, Obama, the Russia case was fabricated. Back in 2016 and 2017, I wrote things about this case that were much sharper than what Tulsi Gabbard has just brought up now. You could dig up such things there. Honestly, you could put everyone behind bars. But essentially, Tulsi Gabbard basically came out and said, well, actually, Obama is the one to blame for everything. Obama made the decision that, the intelligence community's assessment should be given this kind of weight. So, the intelligence community is good. We're not going to clean it up. But Obama's the scoundrel, right? He's the one who said it. That's such a sterile statement. I mean, you can't get to Obama anyway. If you act according to the law, you won't be able to get to Obama. He was the sitting president at the time. And really, this needs to be sorted out. Most likely, the courts will have to deal with this too. That's before anything even happens at all. But with the usual process of prosecution, you probably can't get to him, most likely not, since he was president at the time and made decisions as president, so you'd have to go through Congress, basically go through the impeachment procedure. This is a gray area. Even Dershowitz himself said this is a gray area, that you have to look into each specific case individually. But since he didn't just steal a box of chocolates from a store, but actually acted by exceeding his authority, well, as you might think, abused his power. But this is a presidential crime, so it has to be considered through impeachment. Again, this is still a gray area. It's unclear how this whole thing will play out. So that's the kind of situation we have. So, basically, she set up Obama, who can't be jailed anyway. So that means neither John Brennan, nor James Clapper, nor Comey, no one, absolutely no one, will go to jail. And again, I think that after some time passes, this whole thing, of course, the whole Russiagate story, has long since gotten on everyone's nerves to some extent. Now everyone will just say, well, yeah, once again it's been confirmed that it was all untrue. But if there's another hit like what happened with Epstein, it'll be tough, honestly. That's the situation we're in.
Dmitry, now let's move on. I have one more question I want to ask you, and then we'll wrap up. What exactly is meant by the 50-day ultimatum to Russia? It's interesting that the Ukrainians are shouting that Trump is helping Russia, that he actually gave them time. On the other hand, there's the meeting between Putin and the Chinese leader, and America is waiting for something. So what do you think? Is this really an ultimatum against Russia, or is it actually in Russia's favor?
Well, here's what I can say. There was the Graham-Blumenthal bill in Congress, which proposed imposing similar tariffs and sanctions against Russia. And even though Trump said that, as they say, this bill gives the president a lot of freedom. The text is short, just 3 pages, and it's publicly available on the Congress website. I've read it. It doesn't actually give Trump that much authority, so to speak. This bill would actually strip a significant chunk of the president's powers regarding foreign policy, because after all, Russia is one of the 3 great powers. So basically, all Trump did was, he just got ahead of the game and said, you know what? Like, I'll just go ahead and do the same thing myself. But since he was told that both this bill and what Trump is threatening to do would just crash the entire global dollar economy. So, well, that's actually why there's this idea that investors don't believe Trump's ultimatum, because, well, nothing is really happening. But obviously, if they impose tariffs against China, like 100%, that would mean closing the American market to Chinese goods, and you'd have to start turning containers around right now. Well, it takes about 50 days for those containers to make the trip anyway. And that's why, in fact, he just did it himself. And to avoid doing it right now, he did what he always does in his second term. I'll think about it tomorrow. So, like, 50 days. And by the way, the State Department already said, you know what 50 days means? 50 days is, well, a month more, a month less. But it's up to the president to decide. It's his ultimatum, so to speak, and so on. It's this kind of attempt where either everyone forgets, or the donkey dies, or the potty shop passes away. At the same time, you have to understand that this kind of decision, well, I think Trump is counting on it working out exactly like that. But this calculation might not work out, in the sense that, well, right now both the press and all the politicians in Washington are really putting the squeeze on Trump. They keep extracting from him whatever they need. Just like Europe did, they've already, at least, unfrozen American military equipment to help Ukraine. Formally, someone over there is supposed to pay for it, but in reality, considering that the only real source of money in the world is the US Federal Reserve, well, basically, Europe isn't going to pay for anything. They'll just borrow money from the Fed and pay with that. That's what I just said. This whole arrangement is actually much more complicated than I just explained. But to keep it simple, so I don't have to say things like backstopping, swaps, and all that, or depositing, let's say, reserve currency. I'll just put it simply, they'll borrow from the Fed at a low interest rate, lower than, you know, the standard rate.
0.25. They've already borrowed at 0.25 once before.
Yeah, exactly. By the way, this big scandal was actually exposed by one of the people who sits on the Fed's board. He's one of, you know, like the Board of Governors of the Fed, as it's called. So, yeah, that's how it is. So, the situation is that everyone will be pushing him and saying, Mr. President, so, is Putin behaving well with you? Look at how badly Putin is behaving. When are you going to introduce some draconian measures? Huh? What else can he do? How is he supposed to handle this? I don't know. I mean, really, like I said, I think it was the first time we talked, I told him that in order to get rid of this external control, which they had over him during his entire first term and are still trying to have in his second, he should have declared from the very beginning that this war is a crime. Then they wouldn't have been able to get at him for anything. Or, like anything, yeah, who are the enemies? So who are the enemies? Exactly. But since he didn't do that, well, that's it. Now they're just going to keep dragging him into this. I mean, it's hard to imagine, really, that in 50 days China will suddenly announce, Vladimir Vladimirovich, sorry, but trade with the United States is more important to us. We're going to comply with their ultimatums. Well, it's obvious why China won't comply. It's not because trade relations with Russia are so important, or because cooperation matters, or anything like that. Let's imagine that there are absolutely no relations at all between Russia and China. Especially in recent years, when they've been strengthening, let's just imagine none of that exists. This means that with a simple ultimatum, posted on Truth Social, on Twitter, I don't know, anywhere really, but in this case it doesn't matter where. It could even be an official letter. The United States forced a great power
to bend over,
to do something it doesn't want to do. This isn't just humiliation, it's putting yourself under external control. No way China would agree to that. India's situation is more complicated, that's clear. That's why right now, over there, maneuvering is in vogue. They're trying all sorts of things, and so on. India's situation is much more complicated. But China definitely won't submit. And in that case, they'll either have to shamefully admit, well, there is no Epstein list. Or, what else did he say there? Ah, those are different Houthis, those ones surrendered, but these ones didn't. So here too, apparently, they'll have to say something along those lines. Or, I think there are some people, by the way, in that American MAGA wing of the political class who are actually really counting on this, that the global dollar system will finally collapse. As far as I know about the situation in Russia, this is one of the scenarios that Russia has been directly preparing for a long time, probably since around 2018. And especially actively since 2022. Because no one knew what the real scale of the sanctions would be, so they were preparing, so to speak, for any scenario, a soft one, a medium one, or the two-thirds option, which is actually what was implemented, about two-thirds. As we know, Russia turned out to be quite well prepared for that. But now they'll be preparing for this as well. And, apparently, you know, Russia has its own brand of conspiracy theories too. For example, Prime Minister Mishustin disappeared from the radar for about 3 weeks. Usually, he's very active, always traveling around, holding all sorts of meetings. But for about 3 weeks, well, maybe 2.5, he just vanished. He disappeared somewhere, he just wasn't around. And then he showed up again and went back to doing everything, holding meetings, this and that, developing one region or another, microelectronics, basically all the things a prime minister in Russia usually does. Not politics, but the economy. Well, and, you know, this is basically the same kind of conspiracy theory as saying Epstein was a Mossad agent. Well, he was taking emergency measures just in case Trump suddenly decided to go through with it all. China most likely, almost certainly, has plans for this as well. Because, in reality, all more or less reasonable politicians have been preparing for the possibility that the system might collapse someday.
Yes. Dmitry, one last question for today. So, after those 50 days of ultimatums, Zelensky did something else. He took the anti-corruption agencies and put them under the control of the prosecutor general. I still remember it was many years ago, someone once approached me for help to do a background check. Well, to vet one of the American judges, because this person was part of the commission that selected anti-corruption officials for Ukraine. That was my job back then. Yeah. And now Zelensky has done this. Trump is shocked, very angry, and Europe is in shock too. And then what you could call the second, or even third, Maidan began. People in Ukraine took to the streets, young people came out. So what do you think this is, Dmitry? What is it? Is this really going to be another Maidan? Why did Zelensky so openly go against Trump again? Or was it actually Britain that pushed Zelensky to provoke Trump? What happened?
No, it's more like Trump doesn't control anything in Ukraine. I can say right away, Trump doesn't control anything in Ukraine. That's the main problem. There really is a part of the Ukrainian political class that is seriously dependent on London. That's mostly Zelensky, so to speak, and the top political leadership. And everything that concerns, so to speak, NGOs, parliament, parties, all sorts of things, all this is to one degree or another controlled by the Euro bureaucracy, and earlier, in addition, the US Democratic Party managed this in partnership with the Euro bureaucracy.
Yes.
And since the US Democratic Party has now fallen apart, only the Euro bureaucracy remains, but the British guys seem to think that the Euro bureaucracy can be pushed aside. So they decided to push aside the Euro bureaucracy. Let's note, by the way, that the loudest, so to speak, outcries were coming precisely from the mouths of the European Commission. Von der Leyen even said that she was, so to speak, completely outraged, and so on and so forth. And here, it's more like, you could say, a bit of a shift in power among the shareholders. One shareholder is trying to nudge another shareholder aside here. Most likely, this is connected to the fact that significant losses are about to be recorded, actually, in Ukraine. And everyone also wants to be prepared, really, for a situation where the ultimatum, imagine if the ultimatum comes into effect, right? We said that the dollar-based economy, in a sense, is being told to say its goodbyes. Not immediately, but pretty quickly.
That's true, yes.
But there are also a whole range of political and military consequences.
Yes.
It's hard to expect that Putin, if such measures are introduced, would say, "Oh, that's it, I'm pulling the troops out." Quite the opposite.
Yes.
Quite the opposite. And in this case, the regime could collapse in one form or another, and a whole series of unpleasant issues could come to light, which Europe, America, and, so to speak, Britain would then have to deal with together. That's why you see, changes among shareholders don't happen when a company is in a quiet, calm state. Shareholder shifts happen either when some incredible profit is expected, or when it's time to lock in losses and later shift the blame onto each other. I think this is exactly because they're also waiting for the situation to shift from its current point due to this ultimatum, and maybe even globally. And in this sense, well, they have to push each other somehow. So they've been pushing each other. I don't believe for a second that this Maidan will succeed. That's just not the case here. Unless, for some reason, the Europeans and the British suddenly manage to agree on replacing Zelensky with someone else. The problem is, that wouldn't change anything for Russia or anyone else in this situation. This regime can only be reformed in one way, by completely overthrowing it, that's all. And not just the regime itself, but also the way it has really taken root in the very fabric of the Ukrainian state. And in that sense, yes, this is an interesting event, because these are the first protests not just since the start of the war, but actually the first mass protests under Zelensky at all. But really, this is more like a showdown between two shareholders, so to speak, two shareholders of Ukraine, the European Union and Britain. Nothing more than that.
Did someone bring people out? I don't think they went out. I think there was some kind of external pressure.
The problem is that right now in Ukraine, people in general, even women, are afraid to go outside.
I was surprised. There was a crowd of men standing there.
So, that means someone must have said it was allowed. Yeah.
You see, everyone is just standing there so calmly.
Yeah.
It was fucking surprising.
So, that means someone said it was okay. That, hey, no one's going to get busted, and especially, as they used to say in Nazi Germany, no one's going to be sent to the Eastern Front. Well, someone said it, someone did. Yeah, of course. So obviously, the protection is pretty high up, higher than Kiev.
Got it. Okay, all right, Dmitry, thank you so much for coming and finding time for us. This is really interesting information. I hope I'll be able to catch you more often somewhere because, it'll work out.
Go ahead, catch me. I can't always be, so to speak, available to get in touch. When I can, I come on, as you see.
Thank you very much, and see you in the next broadcast. Thank you so much.
All the best.